All right, so we're going to stay in the East. We're going to talk about this firing of Coach Jim McElwain at Florida. He's a coach that a lot of SEC fans, not just Florida fans, are familiar with because of his days at Alabama, and won a couple of national championships there as offensive coordinator. He got fired today. We're recording this on Sunday. Had some weirdness with the buyout, firing with cause, and the death threat stuff. I don't really want to get into a whole lot of that as much as I want to get into. There's going to be a lot of heat on Florida after this because the traditional, I guess, over the last decade commentary, that's just the regurgitated commentary you hear from national guys immediately after a guy gets fired is, okay, well, he was successful last year, or he was successful for 2 years, and then he had one bad year, and you canned him. I want to ask two things. One, was he that successful his first 2 years, even though he won a division? And two, whether he was or not, was Florida out of bounds by firing this guy? Were they being super impatient, or was it time to pull the trigger?
First, Florida really the past 2 years has had success in the same way that I think honestly Rick had success at Georgia, but even to a lesser extent. The East has been down, and you have to accept that. And you have to accept that it's not just been down, it's been really far down. Tennessee has not been a threat. Georgia has been really inconsistent, and South Carolina hasn't been any sort of South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky really for the past few years haven't been any serious threat either. So when you stack all it up, I mean, who do you have to beat? Really, you have to beat Georgia more than likely, or you have to beat maybe 1 year Tennessee, and other than that, maybe occasionally Missouri. And what we've seen out of Florida the past several years is one, Georgia, again, Georgia under Richt, we talked about that. Yeah, did he make the SEC championship? Sure, he made it in 2012. But he also let Missouri get in that SEC championship in 13 and 14, which was kind of inexcusable in my opinion. Under McElwain, the past few years, really they hadn't what was a really clearly easy route to the SEC championship game. Last year, they lose to LSU, who's one ranked team. The only other ranked team they played in the regular season, excuse me, they beat ranked LSU at the end of the year with Orgeron, and what was a boneheaded play by Orgeron at the end of the game, where the running back runs the wrong way. And then the other two ranked games are Tennessee and Florida State, and they lose by 10 to Tennessee, and they lose by badly to Florida State at the end of the year, right? So you play three ranked games, you go 1-2, but you still make the SEC title, even with an unranked loss to Arkansas, because the rest of your schedule, South Carolina, who was pretty darn terrible last year, Georgia, who was in a coaching change and really struggling, Missouri, who was awful, Vanderbilt, who was awful, Kentucky, who was awful. You beat those teams and you just got in by default. And really, the same thing happened in 2015. Again, how many ranked teams do you play in the regular season? Three. What's your record against those ranked teams? 1-2. You beat Ole Miss early with Greer, and everything was looking up. But then the moment you lose Greer, everything just sort of falls apart. And by the end of the season, the offense had completely and utterly cratered. So, they ended that season in 2015 with a 41-7 beat down by Michigan. And I don't think you can throw all that out. So, did he make back-to-back SEC East title games? Yes. Will he make the SEC East title this year? Yeah, probably not, judging by the way things are going. Having three SEC losses generally makes that unlikely. But I think this is the more important part when you ask, should he be fired? A lot of times to me, it's not necessarily about so much what they have or haven't done, which is always the narrative. It's where are they heading? And in the Georgia game, the reason we had that being such a big blowout by Georgia is that the run defense has taken a huge step back. And we've said this in several videos of the course of the year, but I'm going to repeat it. What we're starting to see this year is the effect of McElwain's drop off in recruiting from what Will Muschamp had been able to recruit. Last year at linebacker, Florida had McMillian, who was the 56th player nationally. They had Anzalone, who's the 57th second player nationally, and they had Gerard Davis, who was only a 3-star, but 492nd nationally, top 500 player. Davis ended up being a diamond in the rough, first round draft pick. So you get lucky with one. Anzalone is a third rounder as a top 50 rough play player. McMillian probably would have gone higher, but he ended up being arrested on felony charges, so we'll never know how he would have been drafted. Those guys, you've got two, probably three NFL level players, are what happens when you have two top 100 linebackers, and then you have another group of guys, one of which ends up being high, and you still had some depth players that could have replaced if Davis hadn't turned out. This year, the new guys who replaced him, you've got Moon, who was a 312th nationally recruit, Reese, who was 414th nationally, and Joseph, who was 651st nationally. None of these guys are rivals 250 recruits. And, late in the Georgia game, they had Garcia on the field. Garcia wasn't even ranked by recruiting services. So it's just, I can't emphasize this enough. If you don't recruit well, it doesn't matter how good you are in this conference, you're going to suffer. And just because you're Florida and it says that on the name of your jersey, if you've got Mississippi State's players, you're going to play like Mississippi State. And for a couple years, I think McElwain is a pretty good X's and O's coach, and I think he managed to keep the ship right. But at a certain point, that drop-off had to hit him. Last year was kind of the big tipping point of that with this past draft class. And what really struck me in that Georgia game is there was a play early where Swift got the edge and has a huge play running down the field. And Reese was the guy that should have been able to catch him. Reese is the guy that had to get Swift before he could turn the corner and get upfield. And he just got flat out run. He dives to make a tackle, doesn't bring him down in large part because he can't get the right angle, and he goes down the field. And then later in the game, right when they blew it out, Swift had another big run, and that was Garcia, who just totally got blown by Swift. I think it was a pass play on that one, and he just got roasted. And that's what happens when you don't have talent. So I think this media narrative that you've got to look at what a guy's done, and man, he's won back-to-back SEC East titles, and I don't think we're hearing that a lot because I think McElwain has done himself a tremendous number of disfavors, the way he's handled things in the media lately. I think that's all a little bit of a red herring because my concern is, look, we've already seen just how bad they're taking the hits from McElwain's recruiting right now. And yes, the recruiting ranking is currently pretty high. That's a little bit of fool's gold, right? Because Florida has 17 commits, and that's really the main reason that they're 7th nationally. They don't have any 5-star players. They have a solid class with 10 4-star players, but that's going to kind of fall off. It probably would have been their best class, but it's still not Florida good. And you're not going to win the SEC East against a upticking Georgia if you're recruiting on this level because you're going to get out athleted. I personally think that if you let a guy go an extra 2 years, 2 years too far, maybe really last year, they already kind of felt like maybe McElwain needed to move on. You start to feel it. And if they let McElwain stay for another year, and let's say the recruiting, things have been shaky, they lose some commits, I think they would have been pretty well devastated because the same linebacking issues, they would have cropped up all around the field. We've already seen the general lack of talent at all the positions. And I think it's really telling to a certain degree how much you have certain players. And I think Malik Davis is a good example. And maybe in the passing game, you have a pretty good guy in Kadarius Toney. The way those guys show up at times tells you basically how much other players don't have necessarily skill. And it's just affecting them, and it's going to continue to get worse. And they've got to make the call now, make the change, turn things around, because if you let this continue to get worse, the same way that McElwain inherited a Muschamp team that was actually really talented, and he was able to basically, in my opinion, live off that for 2 years and be a solid X's and O coach. The next guy is going to inherit McElwain's talent, and he's going to have to build that up again. And you don't want to be in a situation where South Carolina's in right now, where Spurrier, as good of an X's and O guy as he was, didn't recruit for crap the last few years. And Muschamp has a multi-year rebuilding job where it's going to take him really probably 3 recruiting cycles before he has enough depth to really beat anybody with any sort of consistent basis because they're just deficient all over the field right now.
And you talked a lot about the defense that slowly and gradually got worse and worse under Mac. I'd be interested to hear what you thought about his loyalty to Nussmeier, because you and I both have been really critical of Doug Nussmeier on this show, not just in his tenure at Florida, but also dating back to his time at Alabama. That we've never really loved him as an offensive coordinator. And McElwain talked last year about how he was loyal to his guys, and because I think it came up a little bit, probably not as much as it should have, about whether or not he should make a change at offensive coordinator. Well, not only did he make a change, they gave Nussmeier an extension and a raise. I know kind of that was because he was still getting paid for Michigan, but in effect, he got a raise. Talk a little bit about what you thought about him keeping Nussmeier. Like, could he have saved his job if he maybe didn't hang on to Nussmeier last year and went with somebody a little more dynamic, or was the writing already on the wall and sticking with him was just as good as anything else?
I think had they gotten rid of Nussmeier, it certainly, I think it couldn't have hurt, right? I mean, Nussmeier, for better or for worse, really struggles to get much production despite how much offense he's able to generate. And, sort of break it down, and I've looked at this in depth actually recently. Nussmeier in his entire career, it's really only once outside of, I guess, a couple years at Washington that he's ever been able to have a higher scoring offense than he's had a per play yardage offense. And what I mean by that is Nussmeier, whatever he gets in yardage, he's not going to get as much production as another coordinator would be. And
You mean points when you say production?
points? Yeah, when I say production, there I mean actual points. And in the past 9 years, only once did his scoring offense exceed his yard per play total, and that's when he was 100th in scoring and 102nd in yards per play at Florida. Outside of, after he left Alabama, between his Michigan and Florida jobs, he's never finished better than 100th in scoring offense. And even when he was at Alabama in his 2 years there, he took the job in 2012. Now, 2012 Alabama and 2013 Alabama were extremely talented. 2012 Alabama won a national title. 2013 team is a team that kind of fizzled late, kick six game, lost a shot at the SEC championship and title. Both those years, Alabama finished 5th in yards per play, but they finished 12th and 17th respectively in scoring offense. And again, I could go through it, but like even when he took the Michigan job, Michigan really struggled before Nussmeier came in, but they fell from 76th to 89th in yards per play, which is a bit of a drop. But they cratered from 46th to 111th in scoring offense. So, in total here, I'm saying this isn't just a minor point. Nussmeier is really, really consistently statistically bad at putting points on the board. So how does that play out? Well, you've got a guy that has a bad track record, and you know it. And I know he's your friend, and I know you've worked with him. He helped get Nuss the job at Alabama when McElwain left. They coached him together before then. You've got to realize you've got a problem scoring points, and you've got to realize that you have to make a change. And last year, after what they've been able to muster the past 2 years, it's just unacceptable. And so, I think had he let Nussmeier go and replaced him, I think you could have seen a significant improvement. I truly believe a lot of what we saw at Alabama under Kiffin, as much as Kiffin's doing well at Florida Atlantic, and I think he has a lot of potential as a coach, I really think a lot of it is McElwain was a solid offensive coordinator. I think Nussmeier was a bad offensive coordinator. And then when they finally got a guy in Kiffin that was actually a pretty good offensive coordinator, he looked like a freaking genius because he has all this.
Right. Not great offensive coordinator.
Right. Because he has so much 5-star talent to work with. I mean, anybody should look smart when you've got Amari Cooper. And it's easy to, I think people look at that 2014 year where Cooper finished, what was it, 3rd in the Heisman, is drafted first round, starring for the Raiders. And people forget that guy was on the squad for 2 more years. He was on the squad in 2012. He was on the squad in 2013. And he wasn't really overly productive. And in 2012 and 2013, Alabama had A.J. McCarron, who is an probably going to be an NFL starting quarterback. They had easily an NFL number one in Amari Cooper. They had Eddie Lacy. They had T.J. Yeldon. They had 2013. They had Derrick Henry sitting around in the in the bench, and they can't have a dominant scoring offense. I mean, they had really good offensive line talent too. So, I mean, to me, it's kind of baffling how they weren't more productive those years. So, I think really Nuss, in my opinion, the two coordinators I flag is Nuss and Scott Leffler. Leffler's career is probably worse. If you look, he was at Auburn, got Chiswick fired. He was at Virginia Tech. He got Beamer fired. Then he went and joined Adazio at Boston College, and really hadn't done anything. And some way, Leffler's finally finding success in the second half against Boston College. We'll see how that maintains. But yeah, I think Nuss was actually significantly worse offensive coordinator than anyone realized. There were so many, every 3rd and 5 play, you could like clockwork call that they were going to run a drag route over the middle of the field, and every team knew it, and they always sank safeties in or ran a cover 2 and covered it, and it never worked against a good team. I think it's sad, and I understand why you have to be loyal, but I think you also have to realize that Nuss has made $2.4 million to this point from the University of Florida. And you can't be afraid to hurt the guy's feelings because you don't think he's being productive. He's a multimillionaire. McElwain is going to retire as a multi-millionaire. It's a high standard, and you have to live to that standard. Nuss, in my opinion, has never lived to it. I know I gave a lot of talk about statistics because I wanted to back it up with something. And I really feel like Nuss is McElwain's. There were two things that were McElwain's downfall, and I think either one of them would have been sufficient. One, his recruiting is not good enough, and that was going to catch up to them. And two, his offensive coordinator wasn't good enough, and that was going to catch up to him. But when you combine the two, that's how you get fired in just your 3rd year on the job, despite winning back-to-back SEC East titles.
And if reports are true, it wasn't the most, rosy, jovial character to deal with, on the business side either. I want you to talk about this just a little bit. I know we've hammered Nuss all year, but it's so funny how things continue to repeat themselves. Is there an anecdote that better sums up Doug Nussmeier as an offensive coordinator than this Georgia game, where they're not completely out of the game yet? They need some points. They drive the length of the field. And by the way, they had over 5, all 3 running backs had over 5 yards per carry in this game. And even with the chunk plays taken out, they were over 4 yards per carry, which against this Georgia defense is better than Adams did Notre Dame. And that guy's a Heisman candidate, in my opinion. So I think it was like 14-0, 21-0, something like that. And they had a chance to kind of get back into the game. They drive the field. They got a 4th and 1, and this is by memory, also don't kill me. They got a 4th and 1 on like the 7-yard line, and they've been running the ball all the way down the field. And what do they do on 4th and 1? They throw it. And what did I tell you when that happened? I said Alabama fans had PTSD if they were watching this game right there from seeing that. I want you to talk just 2 minutes on that, about how that just kind of summarizes his tenure.
So for maybe Florida fans that don't know, 2012 Alabama, Texas A&M. A&M comes out firing. They get 21 points quick. Alabama comes back in that game. They get a couple big plays. They have a long touchdown pass to Amari Cooper, and they get all the way down, and I think it was the 6-yard line on A&M's 6-yard line in that game, and they're down less than 1 score, okay? 1st and goal from the 6. Nussmeier calls, okay, 1st and goal on the 6. They've rushed the ball successfully all game. This is 2012 Alabama. So this was Eddie Lacy, young in shape Eddie Lacy is the starting tailback, and backups TJ Yeldon. 1st and goal on the 6, and they call 4 straight passes, and the 4th one's an intercepted. It was baffling. A&M hadn't stopped them the entire game running the ball. Alabama had run it down their throats the entire second half, stormed back in that ball game. They had to go 6 yards, and we saw what Alabama did to Georgia. I think this is probably the most frustrating thing and why I'm so critical of Nuss. I'm always critical of coaches when you see how a coach performs for most of the year and when they're in a clutch situation when suddenly the team looks a lot better. Because I always look at that and go, man, like probably LSU Auburn is a good example. If LSU can do that against Auburn, then there was absolutely no excuse for the fact that they lost to Troy. And Alabama's offense was a juggernaut in the SEC championship game and the national title, where they ran the ball with Eddie Lacy and just obliterated people with a power run. But in the A&M game against a team that wasn't very stout against the run, they throw four straight passes, one's intercepted, they lose the ball game. All they had to do was get 6 yards on 4 runs. And as you said, watching this game, it was a freaking flashback, right? Because they drive the ball all the way down, and I'm trying to think here. Yeah, it's 4th and 2 at the Georgia 4, and I know they'd been stuffed the play before, right? But if you look at the past 4 plays, we'll go back. We'll even go back 5 plays. Okay, so they have a 1st and 10 at the Georgia 41. It's an incomplete pass. 2nd and 10, P. Ryan runs for 29 yards to the Georgia 12 for a first down. They have a false start, which makes it 1st and 15. P. Ryan runs for 11 yards and makes it 2nd and 4. Then P. Ryan on 2nd down runs for 2 yards, makes it 3rd and 2. 3rd and 2, they run for no gain. He gets stuffed. And very typical Nuss, he saw that one stuff. Really, if you want to, you can say 2 stuffs. And says, nope, shouldn't run it here, not going to work. He throws a pass. Now, Felipe Franks had not been really consistent at any point in this ball game. You're in a short, or the year. He was 7 of 19 in that game. His yard per attempt average at the end of the game would be 1.6 yards per attempt. So let's bear in mind that if he got his average completion in this, his average pass attempt is not enough to get 2 yards. But because he gets stuffed twice, it's just, I think maybe Nuss doesn't have a strong enough personality, or he lacks confidence, is what I've heard. He gives up and he throws the ball, and it's like, my Lord, man, the past 4 carries, you've gained 42 yards. You're averaging 10 yards a carry on this drive. It's 4th and 2. You're on the 4. Run the dang ball. And I'm not even a run the dang ball person, but in certain circumstances, especially when you have a guy that can't pass and you're in the red zone where it's really hard to pass, you need to understand that you probably ought to run the football. And it's not like they did anything that creative. It was just a simple sprint out throw to the tight end, as I recall. And it's just baffling. And I think one last thing I'll say with that, a story I've heard forwarded about Nuss, because I'm kind of fascinated with the fact that him and Leffler keep getting these big jobs, is in the Alabama-Georgia SEC championship game. There was a very close game that Alabama darn near lost at the end. Alabama didn't start scoring really until the second half when they committed to the run. And it was like they woke up and realized, if we run the ball 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 plays, Georgia absolutely positively can't freaking stop us. And there was a point in that game where Nussmeier tried to get cute and he called a cutesy play, and it didn't work out when they could have just run the ball for a first down. And he turned to somebody in the booth and he said, well, that's my job. Like, he was done. And I've heard somebody was just sort of amazed that an offensive coordinator would ever turn around and go, I can't remember if he said if it's my job or it's like, well, I'm going to be fired. And he was kind of half serious. I just don't think the guy has confidence, and I think he gets too shaken up when he calls plays. And you can see sometimes it's like watching a guy call a video game where he kind of falls back to comfort plays, and he's not aggressive, and he doesn't have a killer mentality, and he doesn't trust his offense to sort of overwhelm the other team. And again, he probably has a very personable guy. I've always heard that. I've heard that McElwain is a pretty easy guy to get along with. I think they're probably very, very smart. They probably do a good job in game prep, but you got to have a little bit of a killer instinct. And I don't think the guy has it. And, in some of these situations, if you abandon what works so quickly and readily, I mean, it's just devastating for your offense. When you can drive the ball all the way down to the 4-yard line, and it was 21-0 at the time, and a chance to put yourself in the back of the game. On a drive, again, that drive started on the Florida 14, and they did it almost exclusively running the football. I'm trying to look through it right now. I think they had 13 yards. Yeah, 13 yards passing on that drive that spanned 72 yards, and you throw the ball on 4th and 2. I don't understand it, and I can't really excuse it.
So I think we've pretty much summarized why Coach Mack didn't get another year at Florida. I want to talk a little bit before we close this out about where Florida goes from here. I know as of this point, Butch Jones still has a job at Tennessee. I know the groomers are really out there. They offered him $10 million or whatever. Where does Florida go from here in terms of potential hires? And if you're the Florida AD right now making a hire, do you go after someone who might be a little less proven as a head coach, but might give you that instant shot in the butt for recruiting? Or do you go with someone that maybe like a Gary Patterson who may not be a great recruiter and may not have any interest in an SEC job at this point? I think we've maybe seen that, but has a track record as a head coach. Which one do you think Florida needs more right now?
I think you always have to look long term. And it's great to say, well, we're going to go get a recruiter. But I think Florida's already been that route. His name was Ron Zook, and it didn't necessarily pan out the way that everybody hopes. I mean, Ron Zook recruited a lot of talent. That talent didn't necessarily form a cohesive team, and it created a lot of chaos down the road. I think you can also ask how the 1 year shot in the arm head coach experience worked for Tennessee when they hired Lane Kiffin, because yes, they had a solid 9-3 year. And strangely, Tennessee fans seem to be looking back on that fondly at times. I've seen that somewhere. But yeah, those same players, like a third of them got arrested. And I think, what was it? I think I saw one time it was like 4 or 5 of that entire recruiting class was all that was left after 3 years. I mean, it was just insane how few of them stayed with that program. You can't just do the shot on the arm thing. You've got to look for a guy that you think is going to be the fit for multiple years. Because at the end of the day, you need consistency. And I think it's imperative in the SEC, if you're a high level job, first and foremost, you have to be able to recruit well. So I'm not saying you don't get a recruiter, but I'm saying you don't look for the guy that's just necessarily the instant impact splash. You want a guy that's going to be able to recruit consistently for multiple years, but also hopefully recruit to a system. For that reason, I know Dan Mullen is a guy that a lot of people love. Dan Mullen, I'm always been very critical of because he does not recruit well at all. He's consistently struggled in recruiting at Mississippi State. Mississippi State's had some really good years where he's coached them up well. Florida is obviously a much easier place to recruit because there is a much larger pool of talent in Florida than there is in Mississippi. But you still got a lot of sharks in the water looking for that talent. And I just don't have a lot of faith that Mullen could step in, based off what I've seen in Mississippi State, at Florida, and necessarily turn it up a notch and have top 5 recruiting classes like you would need to be at the level of success they want to see. So as much as I think Mullen is a good X's and O's guys, I don't think he makes the recruiting requirement. You've got to hit a bar. For that reason, I follow to the next level of candidates. And my opinion for a while has been, I think you have to be willing to pull somebody from a lower level of coaching, and you have to be willing to pull the trigger quickly. You have to say, I'm going to find a guy and try to make sure it works. And I think in this modern world, as much as all the coaches hate it, and I understand it because it's their job and livelihood, but you're paying this guy $4 million a year. And I'm sorry, when you make $4 million a year, you better produce, and you better produce pretty quickly. I can forgive if a lot of things go wrong if you're recruiting well, because if you're recruiting at a really high level, then you can say, okay, maybe this year wasn't great, but we're still building talent, and next year we should be pretty solid. That's the Will Muschamp thing, right? You can give a longer leash because at least the guy that inherits the team isn't going to inherit a mess. When you got a guy that's not recruiting very well, like McElwain, and then it's a bigger problem. So, Scott Frost or Mike Norvell or Justin Fuente, I think are all really excellent candidates. You've got guys that are young guys that have the potential to recruit at a high level. Frost is doing really, really darn well at UCF. Is he perfect? No. And I mean, I think that's, uh, you know, I think the fact that he went from 0-12 to 6-7, and now they started the year 7-0 and were ranked. I think you got to like what you see there, and maybe he can recruit, maybe he can't. We don't really know yet, but you bring him in, you give him 2 or 3 years, and just like McElwain, it's the 3 year mark. If it's not working out, you pull the trigger and you move on to the next guy. And maybe it won't work out, and maybe you won't be an elite team in 3 years, but you know what? You got a chance to do it, because I guarantee you, if you hire Mullen may stick around for 6 years because he's going to do well enough to keep the job. But what you're going to end up with is the first 2 years of Jim McElwain, where, yeah, you're playing for the SEC East title, but you're doing it kind of by default. You're not going to play in a major bowl game, and you're going to be too inconsistent to do a lot. And I think the biggest concern now is if you're at the Jim McElwain level, again, first 2 years of McElwain where you're kind of consistent production, but not really elite. Georgia is just too good right now. And the SEC East is going to see a lot of coaching turnover. I think Muschamp is going to make South Carolina. I don't think they're ever going to be elite, but they're going to be competitive. Tennessee's probably going to make a coaching hire, and they're going to go after one of these guys. And before you know it, you are going to be behind the eight ball. And that winning the East by default, the way you've done with McElwain's not going to be on the table. So you're going to have to get a guy. Maybe he doesn't work out. Maybe the next guy doesn't work out. Maybe it takes 7 years. I'm willing to take 6 years and rotate through a few coaches until you land another Urban Meyer type hire from a mid major. And that's my own opinion, and a lot of ADs are more concerned with getting a 10-win guy. So they'll go after a Mullen, or, they'll chase after, I think Gary Patterson would be an excellent coach. Maybe he isn't a great recruiter, but he's proven he can succeed at a high level. And I think he would recruit in Florida. Problem is, I don't know that you're going to get him at this point. But I would certainly wouldn't go after, say, a Charlie Strong. I think you've already proven that he's not going to be successful at this level. And I think what's going to happen is you're just going to waste 5 years and slip a little more into mediocrity. And before you know it, your brand gets tarnished.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point about, the patience factor. It's, do you want a guy that will immediately take you from potentially an embarrassment to respectability, or are you willing to stick with a guy and get you a championship? Because Nick Saban's come around once a generation, maybe not even that frequently. So for all the rest of us who don't have a Nick Saban, but have still won championships, it's not immediate. It's not. I mean, it's not first year. And a lot of times those first year guys that come in, like I think it was Larry Coker at Miami, they're winning off the previous regime, not the current. So I think that's a good one. One name I'll throw out, and I would love to hear what you think about it, is Matt Campbell at Iowa State. He's making a lot of noise and turning a lot of heads because they've beaten 2 top 5 teams this year already with really inferior talent. It's got to be there in Ames. But he's got a $9.4 million buyout. So Florida's still paying Muschamp. They definitely are paying Mac. I know they try to get out of it completely. They came to terms today on an agreement. They're probably paying him somewhere around 8 to get out of it. So is money a factor for Florida at this point? Is a $9.4 million buyout a reason why somebody wouldn't look at a Matt Campbell? Or is he just not ready for a Florida job?
Well, I think there's sort of 2 points here. One, you mentioned the Nick Saban thing. I think the thing reason I'm saying you rotate is, like you said, Nick Sabans don't come around, and you're going to have to take a bunch of chances. So you try to be the guy that gets Nick Saban from Michigan State. I'm talking more when he went to LSU than Alabama, certainly, but you only do that if you keep rotating through. So I think he's willing to take some risks, because if it doesn't work out, then you're on the table again to see, well, maybe there's a Nick Saban the next 3 years, and maybe there's a Nick Saban 3 years after that. Campbell, I think, isn't at that level yet, though. I mean, Nick Saban came in at Michigan State. He was there for several years. He recruited well and built that program up. This is Matt Campbell's second year at Iowa State. Last year, they went 3-9. Now, he took over a team that was terrible, and this year they're currently 6-2. But, and this is a big but, Matt Campbell has never coached with a program that has to recruit. He has never coached in a major program. Started at Bowling Green, went to Mount Union. Then he went back to Bowling Green, got hired by Toledo, worked his way up to interim coach and then head coach at Toledo, and moved on to Iowa State. He has never held a coaching job that required any level of recruiting or had any expectations. Iowa State is his first Power 5 job. Off the top of my head, and I can check while I'm talking here pretty readily, I don't know of any reason to think that he's recruiting well currently at Iowa State. In fact, he doesn't have a top 50 class. So it's a much bigger risk to me. I have a lot more confidence in someone like a Scott Frost that's at least from the area and has some of those connections. And again, Scott Frost was the offensive coordinator at Oregon. He's been part of a major program. He knows how to recruit. He knows how to run a program like that. Guys like Campbell, I think he may end up being ready, but he needs to make a jump from Iowa State. Either he needs to have time at Iowa State to learn how to run a program that has to recruit at a high level, which is what you need to be really competitive, or he's going to have to jump from an Iowa State and move up to a middle tier program. And again, Florida's an elite job when it's working right. So you can hire somebody that is coaching at I'm trying to think of a good example, Texas Tech. Well, maybe not even Texas Tech. I'm going to think a Michigan State's probably the best one to suggest, but a Michigan State-like job that has some off and on success, even if they aren't necessarily, the best in the world, but they do recruit well, and it gives a lot of opportunities for somebody to prove himself. The issue with Florida, though, is money, and you mentioned this. I think Florida really struggles because, as I understand it, they grew the school a lot, increased enrollment. We're getting into a lot of non-football things here, but they really tried to buy into the hype of scholastic expansion and increase tuition by increasing student bodies. And after the recession, schools shrunk a little bit. Florida was affected by that. It affected the entire university. Another thing is they had a really, really big contract where they had this product called Gatorade they helped develop. That Gatorade money stopped, and the purse strings got a lot tighter. And Florida's fan base is pretty big, but it isn't the big historical fan base that, say, Alabama is, or even, honestly, even Georgia is. So those fan bases have a lot of old money that donates into the program. I don't think Florida has that, both mainly due to Florida as a state, as a younger state, and they don't have the same sort of roots everywhere that some other fan bases do. And they do have to be a lot more cost conscious. But again, I think that kind of favors my model of you do have to get an up and comer and you bring him in and you turn him around. But I think you also have to be very willing to acknowledge the fact that if you do that and you take the quick turnaround model, you're going to be paying a lot of money to hire coaches, and you may be paying a lot of money to buy them out. And so it's definitely expensive to take that route.
Yeah, and I don't think I agree with you on your points about money, and they also don't have the endowment of an A&M or the donor base of an A&M. But I don't think you pull the trigger on McElwain unless you've got a lot of big money guys on board who are ready to go out and get you somebody else. So this is a tough one for me because I agree with what you said that was kind of buried in your last bit is Florida is an elite job when everything's rolling, and they've got a huge recruiting base down there, and it's a good job for somebody. And Coach Mack even said that in his press conference last night. And, as a side, I know he's taken a lot of heat for how he's maybe handled some stuff internally or even externally on the sidelines with his attitude. I don't remember a more gracious, I know I'm about to get fired press conference from someone in history. The guy really represented himself well last night, and he was nothing but complimentary to his bosses at Florida, that program, those fans, those players. Now, he might have been doing a lot of selling for the next job, but one of the things he said that wasn't a lie and it wasn't sugarcoating, Florida's an elite job. And he said, we were brought here to win. We didn't do it. And those things were true. You can do what he did at Missouri and then survive a bad season. You can't do that at Florida. So I agree with what you said in the open. It's not so much what you've done in the immediate. It's the direction you're heading. And we don't really see, a positive trajectory there. So anything else before we close on the book on Coach Mack at Florida? All right, y'all, this has been another great and long week, and it's pretty standard for us now. We're no longer saying that we're running long. We're just running regular. So, again, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Tell us what you think. Give us who you would see as you want to see as the next head coach at Florida. Give us your short list and give us some reasons why you think they would be a good fit and kind of what the odds are that Florida would actually pull the trigger on that head coach. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week and God bless.